Hello, I'm Rebecca McKay, and this afternoon I have the honor of sharing with you some concepts and ideas about the reflection on the lesson study that I taught. And in this webinar that we're doing this afternoon, I will be sharing with you from Savory Library, which is one of the most beautiful venues on the Talladega College campus. And today, as you can see, I have all my tools around me, and I'll be referring to those tools as I build my reflection. And I have brought my favorite company, which are the books and the children's literature that I love so dearly. I brought that as part of the work that I do here at the college, and it fits directly into my lesson that I taught here when I did the lesson study. So today, the first part of what I will be doing will be explaining to you the rationale and the purpose of the research that I conducted on the lesson study and the lesson plan that I wrote. When I taught the lesson, I knew exactly the content that I wanted, but I was a little bit hesitant, as I think many of us are, on how will I dissect this and how will I research this. And I began to think about ethnography has always been my passion, and I thought about autoethnography and the use of myself and my lesson plan, my videos, and the reflections that were given to me from colleagues who studied the lesson as I taught it. And I wanted to share with you how I designed my work to carefully scrutinize and study and produce research based on my lesson plan. I actually used a technique, and I'm going to be referring directly to my document here because I want to make sure that make you aware of my source. Ellis and Adams and Bachner have written a lot about a technique called autoethnography. And autoethnography is basically an approach to research and writing that seeks to describe and analyze personal experience. And this lesson plan was very personal to me. I have used the technique in the lesson plan and the content, but I wanted it to be so compelling that when my colleagues watched the lesson, scrutinize my lesson plan, that they would see my power and what I was able to do with the students that I was trying to serve. So the first part is the content and the techniques that I chose were to have the students move into the four corners of the room, and in each corner I chose an author who had supported the use of children's literature as a part of multicultural education as well as reading programs. And as my students went into those four corners, I wanted them to read and study and have conversation about what they were learning about the use of children's literature as a program and as a way to utilize multicultural materials as a tool for teaching reading techniques and reading skills. And so the content was very, very poignant and very close and dear to my heart. And during the work in the four corners, the students chose the four corner that they wanted to actually utilize. And while they were doing that, they were talking, reading, writing, listening, speaking. They were using all of the language arts, and they could actually feel what that might be like for students in their own classroom. So the content and the rationale and the technique of autoethnography and really taking a look at the lesson plan really gave me insight into what was I learning when I did this lesson study. And if I'd spent all of this time writing the lesson plan, what can I learn from my experience to make it better? And so here is what I learned. I took the stance of what went right and what went wrong. And one of the most important things that I have always done, I actually did not do on the day of my lesson study. And so I would like to reflect on that just a little bit to let you know that no matter how seasoned we are in the lesson study process and in the use of autoethnography, we are going to make some missteps and we're going to make some mistakes. And I usually go to the venue where the lesson is being taught when I do a lesson study, and I do a dry run. Well, of all things, you would think, since I was the first one to do the lesson study, that I would have spent a lot of time in the venue, and I felt like I didn't have time to do it. And for that reason, I feel like that I was not as familiar and not as comfortable as I would have been if I had just been in my own classroom teaching a lesson. We actually did the lesson study in our beautiful Harvey Museum here on the campus, and it is a beautiful space, but there were some things that I wish I had practiced beforehand. One of those things that I wish I had done, and this was brought out in the reflection on the lesson from my dear colleague, Dr. Rhonda Sutton, I failed to actually post the research question for the lesson study. And basically, I kept using different language to describe it to the students. Even though the students had that in their packet, I actually failed to tell them that it was in their packet. So that's what went wrong. What went right was the amazing students that they always saved me. They were so wonderful, they were so thoughtful, and they put so much heart into their reflections. And I was so drawn to who chose which area and which corner, and they were able to do a beautiful job of explaining their particular researcher in the corner that they chose. They did a reading there, they did some charting, and then they brought their reflections back to the group as a whole. So they were the winners in this, and I am going now to reflect just a little bit by looking at my document here, because I want to make sure that my language is correct. So you will, when you watch this webinar, you will actually have a link and have access to my ethnographic research that I did on the lesson plan itself. And the first thing that I noticed was that the lesson plan had great depth to it. And I know that this is my weakness as a classroom teacher. Many times I do not dissect a lesson to its smallest to the largest part in the conceptualization of the lesson. And one of the things that you will notice in my article that I wrote and in the lesson plan that I rewrote is that I actually think that this lesson that I did should have been done over 3 days. And it was much too complex a lesson to try to get the concepts across in one lesson. And so for that reason, in the ethnography piece of the work, and I went back and also used the feedback that I received from my colleagues, the written feedback as well as the feedback that was verbal. I also listened to my students carefully in the video, and I watched them carefully, and I realized that day one should have been building a great deal of background knowledge on these different authors and different writers about the use of children's literature for content and for teaching materials. And I noticed that my students were not reluctant. They embraced their author, but I could not help during my autoethnography reflection, I could not help but think about how much more richer their conversations would have been if I had allowed them on day one to have built more background knowledge on all 4 of those specific authors and researchers that were presented in the 4 corners. So that was my big aha on the lesson. I also will never go into a lesson study another time without posting my research question, because that grounds the whole lesson and it keeps everyone on the same page and it keeps the language clean of what it is that we're actually trying to do with this lesson. You will actually be able to see that through a link on this webinar. You will actually be able to see the lesson plan that I dissected, and you will see all of the research questions and exactly what we were going for. Another thing that I feel like that went well in the lesson, and I'm very proud of the fact that during the lesson studies, everything has been extremely authentic. And we have really been posing questions about the ethics of teaching and the ethics of what materials that we choose to use for our teacher candidates. And many people want to bypass the choice of literature. I get a lot of different feedback from different journals as well as from friends who are out in the field. And many times I hear, well, that's an old concept, that's kind of an old notion. But it has held true for me through years and years and years of teaching. And I feel like it's one of the things that the students really grasp here. And it may be one of the first times that they have been in a college classroom in the teacher education program where they really talk about the choice of literature and why would you want to match that literature to the children that you serve. So for that reason, I was very, very, very proud of what I wrote. And again, the middle part of the work would have been doing the four corners. I would have taught a lesson prior to, and in my lesson plan, you will see how I divided that out. The middle part would have been a piece that you actually will see on the video clips of the classroom lesson. And then the final part, I would have my students do a third part of the lesson and have them doing more deep reflection individually instead of working in groups. So that has been my biggest takeaway from the ethnographic work that I did in my lesson plan. And I am not one who loves to rewrite something like a lesson plan, but I found it to be comforting to me that I had done a good job of the lesson plan, but I actually did not know what I didn't know until I went back and did the autoethnographic research on that lesson plan. I will tell you that in conclusion, when I teach this lesson again, one of the things that I would do, I would have more literature on the tables. I would have more tools rather than having one packet of materials. I might even set up a venue where the students could actually watch short video clips of the researchers talking about their work. And a lot of that reflection came from the rigor that I saw through my colleagues' lessons. By the third and fourth lesson that my colleagues in the teacher education department taught, their lessons were multifaceted. The next time I do this work, I will have many different actions going at those four corners rather than just having a packet of material. I don't like to think of myself as being one who always errs on the side of caution. The only rationale I can give for my thinking for doing it the original way that you will see in my lesson plan, I wanted it to appear very doable, and I wanted the lesson to be powerful. And I realized that I shortchanged my students by not giving them more options of actions that they could take to deepen their understanding of these researchers and these authors of children's literature, as well as researchers of many, many talented African American researchers who write about the use of first-hand materials and children's literature to teach and to use that as teaching tools and materials. Now, what this meant to me is it pretty much means everything to me. I know that sounds kind of trite, but I never had the opportunity to deeply study children's literature in all of the years that I worked in my pre-service, in my in-service, and in my graduate level classes until I did my PhD. Honestly, I was never taught what I am teaching my undergraduate students until I got to the PhD level. To me, that is such a disservice to the students in teacher education programs. I would say the thing that I'm most proud of is I'm no longer afraid to say that I would do it, and I will continue to do it. I will also use the scripted programs that my students need to learn and they need to know, but I believe the power in what I taught in that lesson and how I am dividing that lesson now into 3 segments will give my students the rationale and the thinking to support the use of the representation of the children in the books and the materials that they serve. It is often the case now in today's world that we're codifying curriculum, and I'm all for that. I think it's an important part of what we do in teacher education. I also think that we need to empower our teacher candidates to be bold and to think what resonated with you in your undergraduate program. What stood out to you? My greatest hope and my greatest dream is that my students would say the children's literature and the authors who write about the use of children's literature in the class and the way they teach us how to represent the children that we serve in the materials that we use. So that's my takeaway, and I hope you enjoyed this webinar and the tools and materials that will go along with it. And I will just say that I want to thank you for the opportunity to share my heart and my soul with you today regarding the use of children's literature as ways to teach children in classrooms about who they are, from where they come, how they can deepen their understanding about that through reading books of their choice and through reading authors and people who represent their culture, their race, their families, their customs. And the best way, in my opinion, to do that is to explore children's literature in undergraduate programs, to let undergraduate students actually get to know the authors. As I stated earlier, we're here in the beautiful Savory Library, and one of the first things that I did when I came to this college as a white woman was I felt a very compelling draw and rationale for why am I here and what is my purpose. And I worked with a college librarian, and we actually have a whole section of children's literature by the best authors and artists of color that is represented in this library that anyone in our community can use. And as our students move on and take jobs in schools, they will always know that those books are here, and it doesn't matter how old they are or when the publication date is in the front cover of the book. They will know that these books are classics and they are timeless, and their students will resonate, the books will resonate with the students, and it will help them to have confidence in who they are and from where they come. So thank you for spending this short time with me, and I hope you enjoyed this and take away the idea of using autoethnography to dissect your lesson plans. And it's really not as difficult as it sounds, but remember, I had good friends who had my back. I had representatives in the collegiate community that participate in our lesson studies, and I had the greatest students in the world who helped me to think through that lesson as I watched how they responded to me on video. So just remember those ideas and those concepts when you're thinking about how to make your lessons better and how to conduct lesson studies that are dynamic and bold and can really spring your teacher candidates forward. Thank you.